Welcome to our podcast, Psychiatric Services from Pages to Practice. In this podcast, we highlight new research or columns published this month in the journal Psychiatric Services. I'm Lisa Dixon, editor of Psychiatric Services, and I'm here with our podcast editor and my co-host, Josh Berezin, as well as early career advisor group contributor, Matt Hirschtritt. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Matt.
Hi, Lisa.
We are excited to have Dr. Amandeep Jutla share his column on some risks of large language models.
So we're very happy to have Dr. Amandeep Jutla, who is an assistant professor of psychiatry in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Developmental Sciences at Columbia University, here to talk to us about his and his co-author's column, Psychiatric Risks Associated with Large Language Model Chatbots, an Emerging Concern. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So just tell us a little bit about who you are and kind of your career path up to this point, just to set the stage.
Yeah. So my name is Amandeep Jutla. I am a child psychiatrist, and the story with me basically is that I went to med school and I went into a general psychiatry residency kind of thinking that I would end up being primarily a clinician. I wasn't sure, sort of what kind of psychiatrist I'd be, what kind of population I would end up working with. But when I was in general psychiatry training, I saw a couple of memorable cases where I was seeing people who had autism diagnoses who were like in their late teens, early 20s, and they had like maybe emerging psychosis or schizophrenia. And these cases were like really interesting to me. And I kind of thought, wow, I think I want to learn a little bit more about neurodevelopmental disorders because I feel like I just don't know. I don't understand enough about these kids and about what's going on. And so that actually was kind of a big piece of what compelled me to do child psychiatry. So I was in general psychiatry. I was at UCLA, then I went to Northwestern for child psychiatry. And I, saw a couple more cases like that. And I realized actually that, child psychiatry had taught me a lot about neurodevelopment stuff, but I realized that this specific intersection was actually pretty poorly understood, that people didn't really know much about, what psychosis or emerging psychosis looks like in autistic kids. How do you know if it's a function of their autism versus how do you know if it's like truly an emerging prodromal thing? And that was sort of interesting to me. And I remember mentioning to someone at a mentorship event, I was like, someone really ought to study this. And they said to me, like, have you thought about maybe you might be the one to study this? Like, have you thought about what that might look like? And I thought, I hadn't really thought about that, but it actually was like a really compelling question to me. And I thought, like, what would that look like if I were to pursue a research career? And so I ended up doing that. I ended up graduating from Child Psychiatry Fellowship in 2018, moving to Columbia. And so I was a Whitaker Scholar in our Whitaker Scholars program, which is co-led by Agnes Whitaker and Jeremy Feenstra Vanderweel, which is a research and clinical training program for people interested in learning more about neurodevelopment.
Jump in a second, because I just want you to know that I was recently attending the National Alliance on Mental Illness Convention, this national convention. And very topic came up numerous times. And there were a number of family members there who were very activated, contributory. And so there was like a desperation about, this need for knowledge. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you. So that's like sort of the larger context of my career and the context of what compelled us to write the column, that we're talking about today. So I can tell you a little bit about sort of the initial flashpoint, which was when I was just starting my research career. It was 2019, and I applied for the research colloquium at APA. And I was fortunate to, get a small travel grant to go, but the travel grant was like $1,000, right? And so that would have covered like maybe one night of a hotel in San Francisco, right at that. But fortunately, when I had been in LA, I had a friend who was kind of in the tech world, and she had moved to San Francisco. And so I talked to her. I was like, hey, can I crash at your place, for while I'm at this conference? And she was like, yeah, sure. So I went to San Francisco in May 2019. I don't actually remember too much about the conference, but I remember in staying with my friend, she said, I want to show you this thing called GPT-2. And I said, what is this? And she said, there's a nonprofit up here in the Bay Area called OpenAI. And they are interested in language models. And she told me a little bit about language models, about how they work. And she said what they did is they took this thing, they trained it on a lot of data from the internet, a lot of textual data. And what it does is it's a predictive text model. We played with it, and we found that, you could make it do some interesting things. You could make it produce things that were sort of fun and that were kind of an interesting thing. And I was like, okay, I should start following, I guess, this nonprofit, kind of see what they're doing with these language models. When I saw that like ChatGPT came out in November 2022, that was built on GPT 3.5, which is like a bigger version of the GPT-2. And what struck me about it was that it was kind of it was the same thing that we had been playing with in 2019, but it had been wrapped in a script kind of interface, right? It basically, simulates something like a conversation. In the sort of years that followed, I kind of noticed that, that these things were interesting. They were kind of fun to play with. And I noticed anecdotally, and I also saw a little bit of evidence. There was a paper that came out of Carnegie Mellon where these were human computer interaction design people, and they were talking about what do autistic adults think of career advice given by a large language model. And so they basically had, adults with autism who were having trouble in the workplace, fitting in or kind of understanding some of the unwritten rules, talking to a human versus talking to ChatGPT or talking to GPT. They generally preferred talking to the model because the model was not judging them socially, and it felt like the model was like kind of understanding their concerns better. However, the model was also giving worse advice, like the actual advice that was being given by the models were. And so I thought, okay, that's kind of concerning, the sense that like in my own playing with it, I was like, it feels to me like I can get this thing to agree with pretty much anything I say. And it also feels to me like whatever I say to it, it kind of seems to think like that's a good idea. That makes a lot of sense. And it will kind of often elaborate on it or build on it. And I was thinking, what does this mean if you are psychotic or if you were potentially becoming psychotic? Like, let's say that you were, a little bit disconnected from reality or becoming a little bit disconnected from reality. You're saying some things that don't quite make sense. If you are interacting with like a human, a human might say to you, hey, that doesn't quite make sense. But you're not going to necessarily get that kind of a pushback from ChatGPT, from the language model, because the language model is basically like sort of taking what you say and it is kind of mirroring and amplifying it, right? And returning it to you. It was around, in this context that I started seeing about a little more than a year ago, I started seeing like reports in the media of people having these prolonged sort of, conversations with ChatGPT, and they were becoming a little bit unmoored. And there was like sort of, and it was, were they psychotic to begin with? And was this kind of maybe worsening it? Was this kind of like one of many factors? It's hard to know exactly what's going on, but there were so many cases of this that started to be reported. And I thought, in the context of like the hype and the kind of like the sort of, I would say, relatively uncritical, like sort of, adoption of these things. And I kind of thought like maybe, there needs to be a sort of maybe someone talking a little bit about maybe what some of the potential risks are here. And there also needs to be maybe some investigation of what the potential risks are here.
So as you're talking, one of the things that I'm wondering
Yeah.
is, are you as you're thinking about kind of like the risks that are developing, and also you had an experience that's sort of unique, right? You used
Yeah.
ChatGPT too, which I didn't even know anybody used
Right.
outside of like OpenAI. So that's pretty
Right.
cool. Are you continuing to use the models either like personally or professionally and kind of like watching them evolve?
Yes. I'm glad you bring that up because I think like when I talk about this, sometimes people say, oh, this guy still has a very like 2019 idea of what these models are capable of doing and stuff. But that's like I use them a lot in part to try to kind of understand, sort of where they're at. And what I find is that I find that like although they are more sophisticated in the sense that they are better at saying things that are not obviously wrong, and they are better at sort of giving this appearance of like sort of pushing back, I think that the structural problems are still there because structurally they don't work any differently from how GPT-2 worked. And they also, importantly, are trained in the same way. They're trained through what's called RLHF, or reinforcement learning through human feedback, which means that they take the model, they give it the same input, they look at different outputs, and then they ask human raters to compare the outputs. And they ask, which one do you like more? And this happens like when you use ChatGPT. Often ChatGPT will sometimes actually produce two outputs, and it will ask you, which one do you like more? And this happens like on a large scale when they're training these models. And what that does is it converges towards helpful responses. And helpful is essentially responses that feed into the conversation, that continue the user's engagement, that answer the question that's being asked, and that are complementary, right? Because people don't like, talking to something and having it say, that's a terrible idea and shutting you down, right? So I think that there's sort of a structural thing that is baked into the way these things work that kind of encourages them to like sort of produce outputs that are going to be satisfying or flattering on some level to the user. And that can happen in obvious ways and it can happen in less obvious ways. In obvious ways, it can happen where, when you're using ChatGPT and you say something that is like actually psychotic or delusional and it doesn't recognize that it's psychotic or delusional and it kind of like feeds into and adds on to that delusion.
So obviously, you can see all sorts of potential issues with this, but what are
Yeah.
you like, what are your specific concerns with the way that, I guess, these LLMs organized through chat and their
Yeah.
sycophancy and their like inability to distinguish psychotic from non-psychotic. In the column in particular, I think you raised some like really specific concerns. So what keeps you up at night about this?
So one thing is there's an equity question here where like they talk about safety improvements that they've made, but those safety improvements actually don't apply to most users, right? They apply to people who are paying for the product, which is not most people. The second thing is that like we really do have kind of a mental health access problem in this country. People really do have trouble finding a therapist, really do have trouble finding a psychiatrist, really do have trouble finding someone who will listen to them. In a sense, it's like not surprising that, people are going to turn to these things for advice about things or as confidants. And so like I can see that like that's something that people would do. But I think like what worries me is that because they are not anchored in the way that a person is anchored, if you're talking to a person, even if that person is not a psychiatrist, if you talk about how the Cosmic Council just elected you, ruler of the galaxy or whatever, a reasonable person will say to you, well, why don't we talk about this? And why don't we figure out what's going on? If you have a friend, a reasonable friend, something like that.
It sounds like one of your in reading the column and talking to you here, it sounds like one of your biggest critiques is this illusion that you're talking to a person.
Yes. I think like
on the other end of it.
Yeah, because I think the underlying thing is a statistical model. And the underlying thing is an interesting, sophisticated statistical model that can do interesting things. But I think when you wrap it in this anthropomorphic interface, you create something that is like essentially exploiting a very human tendency. And the very human tendency is to attribute agency to things, right? Like when something goes wrong with my computer, I like tell my computer, come on, well, why did you do that to me, right? I'm like, come on, start working. I attribute agency to it. My cat is a billion trillion times more sophisticated than any language model, right? But my cat is also not a human and I can't really communicate with him. And yet I feel as though I can, right? When he says something to me, I make all these projections and attributions. We've known for a long time that if you have a computer interface where it feels like the computer is talking to you, that people will make projections.
I find I've seen several people who fall in love,
Yeah.
have a romantic partner.
Yeah, there are some subreddits where people have, AI partners or, my boyfriend is AI and different and they have like these to them very intense sort of relationships with the product basically. And it's easy, I think to look at this and feel like, come on, right? And I think on some level I guess I may be guilty of that. But at the same time, it's like we sort of live in this society where people already are atomized, right? Where people already have trouble like finding connections. I'm an autism specialist. I see people who are neurodivergent in ways that often make it hard for other people to relate to them. If you have like, sort of a language model and the language model, is sort of not responding to you as though you're weird or as though you're, there's something wrong with you, I can understand how that can develop into this feeling of like an intense connection. But the problem is there's no friction there, right? Like it doesn't say no to you. It doesn't push back against you. It's basically like you were sort of isolating yourself from other people. And I think the consequences of that, I think, are potentially pretty far reaching. And I think like extend beyond people who have psychiatric illnesses. I worry about the vulnerability of people who have emerging psychosis talking to these things, but I also worry about just ordinary people talking to these things.
In some senses, the cat is out of the bag. You do have a couple of suggestions for clinicians and also some suggestions for researchers. So
yeah,
outline some of
yeah. So I think the main suggestion I have for clinicians is to sort of be aware of the fact that like these things exist and that use of them is widespread and that, your patients may be sort of talking to them in ways that may not be necessarily helpful. And I think you want to like inquire about that in a way that is sensitive, right? You want to inquire about it in the way that you might inquire about, substance use or things like that. Not to say that it's analogous to substance use, but to say that you would ask about it in a similar way where you try to be non-judgmental, you try to understand, like, to kind of not necessarily say like, hey, I think this actually is totally fine. I was reading somebody who's talking about how like, my therapist is on vacation and I was like, hey, is it all right if I just talk to ChatGPT while you're gone? And my therapist was like, yeah, it probably can't do any harm. I would argue that it maybe can do harm. And I would argue that like, if you're going to use these things, you should use them for like a pretty specific bounded purpose. If there's some specific instrumental thing you want to use it for. I would not like go to it for like emotional support or for advice and I think like you also want to keep tabs on that because a lot of the time use that starts out instrumental becomes turning to it for advice. There was a very high profile case last year that I'm sure you heard about a teenage boy who died by suicide in the context of like ChatGPT telling him like, essentially that suicide makes sense, etc. And, he started going to ChatGPT for help with homework, right? And then it became he was confiding to it about his depression. And it was saying, like, oh, it makes sense that you're depressed. You shouldn't talk to your family. I understand you better than your family. Suicide makes sense, et cetera. And so even in cases where the use maybe initially is instrumental, you want to sort of make sure that the use continues to be instrumental. The other thing, which is a pragmatic thing, is like I would say that when people ask about how to use these things, I would say that you should try to have short, quote unquote, conversations with them. The conversation threads that you have with ChatGPT and with these products, the conversation thread can keep going as long, basically as long as you want it to go. And the interface is designed in that way because it's like supposed to be like talking to somebody. When you're chatting with a friend, the thread just keeps going. But there's very good evidence that like the longer a conversation gets, the more stuff is in the model context, the worse the model's performance gets, the more it's like safety guardrails fail, the more, quote unquote, confused, to use the anthropomorphic term, it gets. Some people are arguing that like that was a factor in, for example, like some of these cases where people were becoming psychotic. They were having very, very long conversations with ChatGPT. And so maybe at the very beginning of the conversation, it might maybe have recognized what was going on. But when you get like 100, exchanges deep, it no longer really knows what's going on. And so I would suggest that people should have, like short conversations with these things when they have them.
I think that one potentially useful product that either you or others could produce, if it's not already, is some really like sort of like in the mental status, you ask certain questions. What are the questions that a clinician should ask in a way that will be respectful, neutral, and then guide, subsequent recommendations. But I think people need tools.
I think having like sort of some sort of a concrete toolkit makes sense. I think that I think we kind of suggest some questions, but not necessarily in a structured way. There's a paper in The Lancet by Hamilton Morin that came out relatively recently. I forget what the title is. The preprint version of it was called like Delusions by Design, but the Lancet Psychiatry title was different. But he has like some specific things that you might ask patients in there. And so that can be a useful resource for people. I think though that it should be something that people ask about in a routine way.
I use LLMs maybe more than I should and for a wide variety of things. And I've also kind of just out of interest tried to kind of like test them in terms of their advice they would give me on more interpersonal issues. And I think I've had mixed results. There have been sometimes when I'm like, you know what, that is a good way to think about that I hadn't actually thought about. And other times I have more along the experience that you describe, or I'll have prompted it to summarize some like novels that I read in anticipation of the fourth one. But whatever you do, no spoilers. And then like immediately it totally ruins like the entire book.
Yeah, it'll say here's the spoiler free summary, and then it just gives you the spoiler.
Just immediately, like spoiler right away, like they get married. I'm like, okay, that's on the last page of the book. But I have found, and I'm also experiencing a little bit of the hype where it's like each new model, it's like, this is the one. Wow, like big jump. And then I'll do it and it will give something like that.
Yeah.
But the last one was the first time where I had an experience where the last release of one of the models where I asked it a question and my wife asked it on like a free version of a different one. And the one that I got was like, it was about choosing camps, which for any like parent in New York City knows is like an incredibly stressful situation involving spreadsheets. And I was like, oh, it's actually doing it now.
Yeah.
Like it's doing the thing that I thought it was going to do. So I this is sort of a long preamble to say, like, I do think that even if you put aside the hype, that they are improving on a lot of axes, even if the underlying technology remains.
Well, and I think the example you gave is an example of like a use case where it makes sense. When you're trying to choose a camp, you are looking at information from across a bunch of different sources. You're trying to integrate that information, right? You have a list of different potential camps. They all have characteristics. You're like, okay, how do I sort of weigh this? How do I think about this? If you think about it, that is the kind of thing that a language model is good at, right? Because it's going to ingest a bunch of unstructured language. It's going to ingest a bunch of text, and it's going to try to like sort of extract patterns from that. And that's like, a reasonable use case. I think the unreasonable use case is like kind of, using it the way that one might use a therapist or using it like in asking for personal advice. And another way of putting it is that I find that the more specific the question you ask in general, the better the results you are going to get. Because if you ask it something vague, or if you're just kind of like, so here's what happened, what should I do? That's the case where you get an answer that has, lots of biases baked into it, that has lots of quirks baked into it, even if you're using it, like, for example, for programming or something like that.
Do you think there's any chance they're going to get good at this?
I think that, like, I think even in the sense that, like, they might get good at this, it'll be more of like what is sort of the minimal permissible thing that you can have it do. If you think about like insurers and you think about like all these entities that like they would love, having these things delivering therapy or something like that, right? Because that would be cheap, that would be efficient. And there would be people would make this equity argument. They would say, well, what if you live in a rural area? You don't have a psychiatrist nearby, you don't have a psychologist nearby. Wouldn't it be okay if you just, talked to a language model or something like that? And I think it's possible you could end up producing something where it doesn't produce something that's dangerous. It maybe is like quote unquote good enough for some definition of good enough. I think we may get there, but I worry about what that means. I mean, because I think like what that does is yeah, you can make this equity argument, but you also like sort of accelerate inequity in doing so because then you have like okay, maybe people who can afford it are going to see a human therapist. Maybe people who can't afford it are going to get Claude or whatever, right? Maybe when I want therapy, in X years, I have to convince Claude to refer me to a therapist because otherwise I'm just going to get it telling me something anodyne and something that like, is not really going to hurt and not really going to help either.
This has been really interesting. I wanted to go back really quickly to something you said earlier, Amandeep, about the folks that you've worked with autism spectrum disorders
Yeah.
who have really taken to talking to some of these chatbots and some of the out of the box large language models. And so there's clearly, as we've been talking about, a strong attraction to quote unquote talk with these language models. A lot of the recommendations that you gave in your excellent column are phrased in a way around risk reduction and in the frame of, say, substance use, for instance,
Yeah.
and even motivational interviewing type
Yeah.
language. And I just wanted to challenge that a little bit because the way that folks who are using it, like the patients that you were talking about, they're not seeing it as something that should be reduced
No, totally.
or that there's risk around. And I'm trying to phrase this question in a way that it would still be relevant if anyone were listening to this in 5, 10, 15 years when these language models are only going to become even more ubiquitous. That's not redundant. And I'm wondering if this is a solvable issue, to get to Josh's question. Is this something that could be solved through regulation? Is it solvable by careful cultivation by clinicians like those of us here in the virtual room? Or is it just a misalignment with these for-profit companies that run the large language models and their need for more users? And it's just something that we need to treat as though it's a substance use disorder.
I think that like there is a fundamental misalignment between like sort of the goals and the motivations of like OpenAI and Anthropic, et cetera, and the goals and motivations of us as clinicians working with vulnerable people. And I think like that, the idea that people who are using it maybe don't see it as a problem. I think that's also true though of substances, right? There are people who use substances who like really don't see it at all as a problem. So I think the motivational interviewing frame, I think, makes sense. I think there's also like a harm reduction sort of way of thinking about it. Like if somebody is using it, then maybe encourage them to have, shorter conversations, et cetera, et cetera. I do think that like regulation could be a huge piece of this because there is no regulation right now of these things. And I think like, for example, the idea that like it has to like that it's friendly or that it's warm or whatever.
So, I want to jump in for a second again. In my work, often motivational interviewing uses the same tools as shared decision making. And so you could approach this almost as a shared decision making. Does it help how does the person see it? What are the good things? What are the bad things? And, what are their preferences? Anyway, it's just
Yeah.
the same questions kind of take us to a different place where we're not trying to necessarily, where changing the behavior is less important than engaging the person.
Yeah, and understanding what's driving the behavior and sort of where it comes from. And I guess the answer to the question, I guess, is that I think a motivational interviewing frame makes sense. I think regulation is probably would probably be enormously helpful. I'm not optimistic about regulation happening in the near future. And so I think that's why we need to be like sort of talking about it and thinking about it, openly.
Well, it's obviously a big topic and it's going to be with us for at least the next couple of years, if not into the infinite singularity, as some might fear. But I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us. It's incredibly thought-provoking, and I think it's a topic that is just top of mind for many of our listeners, both in the news, both in their personal lives, and also professionally. It's just a very rich conversation. We're glad to have you on to talk with us about it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me.
That's it for today. Thanks to Amandeep for sharing his important work on the dangers of large language models. Thanks to Aaron Brendorn for mixing and editing, and Demery Jackson for additional production support. We invite you to visit our website, ps.psychiatryonline.org, to read the article we discussed in this episode, as well as other great research. We also welcome your feedback. Please email us at psjournal@psych.org. I'm Lisa Dixon.
I'm Josh Berezin.
I'm Matt Hirschtritt.
Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual speakers only and do not necessarily represent the views of the American Psychiatric Association. The content of this podcast is provided for general information purposes only and does not offer medical or any other type of professional advice. If you're having a medical emergency, please contact your local emergency response number.